infinite complacence, people went to and fro of the earth about their little affairs, serene in the assurance of their dominion over this small, spinning fragment of solar driftwood, which by chance or design man has inherited out of the dark mystery of time and space.
On this episode of Into the Fray, I welcome filmmaker, researcher, and adventurer Aleksander Petakov of Small Town Monsters. Welcome on, good sir.
Thank you, Shannon, for having me. Honored to be here. It's always a good time, meeting of the mind sort of thing. So I'm excited for this.
Absolutely. And we were just saying how it was just odd to me when I realized that you had never officially been on Into the Fray. So I figured it was about time because you have a lot of your own exciting things always going on, but you also have a brand new documentary series titled Strange Places coming out. But before we go there, and of course mention the Kickstarter, which is winding down and people need to jump on, let's discuss some of your other projects and places that you've been, because you've been all over the place. I mean, you're probably gone more than you are home, I would imagine. But could we start in Alaska? And I was, of course, brokenhearted because I couldn't make that trip. And then by the time I saw the footage, what a gorgeous place. Had you been there before that trip with STM?
Yeah, so I'd been to Alaska once when I think I was in high school, went with my family. We did kind of like a touristy sort of thing. I mean, it was amazing to be there, but, I was more or less a kid at the time. I didn't really have the chance to go explore or do a lot of things on my own, right? You're with your family and you do all the typical touristy stuff. I didn't really grow up camping a lot. My parents, they grew up in Eastern Europe under communism, so they weren't like super into the outdoorsy kind of stuff. So I kind of got into that on my own accord. So going back to Alaska in 2022, which was the first time I went with STM, because there's been 2 trips now, was really incredible. And it was, prompted by this interesting case that I was kind of involved in with a gentleman up there who I'd become acquainted with, who had this property with a really interesting history of activity. So that's what kind of spurred that trip on. And of course, then we did all the other STM productions up there on the trail, Bigfoot, The Last Frontier, Land of the Missing, and then, what became my series, or 2-part series, I guess, the Alaskan Coastal Sasquatch, which was part of that Bigfoot Beyond the Trail series that has kind of been most of what I've been working on the past few years has been Bigfoot Beyond the Trail, or Beyond the Trail as it's referred to. So yeah, that was an incredible journey. Obviously we were bummed to not have you there. Every time we do these, kind of, it's like once or twice a year we have these crew wide shoots, because a lot of times I'm off doing my own projects. Other people, Seth and other people, they've got their own stuff going on. We're all kind of doing our own things in the STM universe, but then we converge for these shoots like we did in the LBL. It's always fun to have you along for those kinds of trips, but that Alaska trip was it was a bit of a whirlwind, especially for us. So it was incredible.
And that one property that you just talked about, is that what you guys refer to as Area A?
Yeah, so that's the name. I don't know exactly the origins of the name Area A. I think it was kind of like a tongue-in-cheek thing that researcher Larry Beans Baxter, Rob Roy Menzies, and the property owner kind of came up with. They were trying to think of cool names because they're like, oh, everyone's got these snappy acronyms and names for their cool places. You've got stuff like Area X, of course, just lots of different areas. And they're like, what about Area A, like Area Ape? Maybe that was they thought that was sort of funny. And that's just what they went with. It was not supposed to be like a serious thing. But we just kind of referred to it as Area A. Just kind of, it's easy. It's easier than saying, I don't know, Kenai Peninsula wooded area. Just kind of doesn't really roll off the tongue. So Area A, yeah. So that was a really interesting case, and I'll I'll paint the picture a little bit, maybe people that aren't familiar, that essentially a guy in Alaska, who I've become acquainted with, he built a remote cabin about an hour boat ride from the nearest town on the rugged southern coastal Kenai Peninsula, which is absolutely gorgeous. I mean, you think of the Kenai Fjords National Park, it's that type of habitat that goes for basically hundreds of miles along the southern coast of the Kenai Peninsula. And it's thick, dense rainforests that are on the shoreline, and the mountains just rise up from the ocean. So it's extremely steep. It's people that are familiar with the story of Port Chatham / Portlock. That's, one of the most famous Bigfoot kind of cases in history, or alleged cases. That is the southern tip of the Kenai Peninsula. So that is the same type of habitat, essentially, where this guy built his property. And they'd had kind of the stereotypical Bigfoot type activity, or alleged activity, the rocks being thrown, whoops, whistles, mystery gunshot noises, wood knock type noises, slaps on the side of the cabin, all kinds of stuff going missing, that sort of stuff. Very typical. And that had gone on for a while, and a number of people had gone out there and had stuff like that happen. So about a year before May of 2022, when we first went out there, I had come in contact with the property owner, Scott, and became acquainted with him. And he kind of explained everything, and I got to talk to people who had been out there, who had stuff happen. One guy was a retired biologist, and it was just a very interesting place. I thought, well, the Kenai Peninsula, Alaska, it's such a wild area, such a great habitat. If there's a place for something like a Sasquatch to be, that is an area where you'd kind of expect it, right? Because it's just still so wild and untamed, and it's so hard to get to some of these places. You can physically only get into a place like Port Chatham by boat or float plane. Same thing with Area A. Same thing with the area that Les Stroud had his mysterious encounter that was in Survivor Man in the first season, that he kind of didn't even really talk about. It was just a weird encounter he had while filming in this area. I got to recently do a video about the Kenai Peninsula encounters, where I interviewed Les Stroud. He talked about his encounters, also did some Port Chatham stuff, and of course, little Area A. But to kind of backtrack, not to add things on, but so Area A, that's the area that that's what we call it. And I've been there twice now. Once that initial trip in 2022, and then I was back up there this past summer in 2023. I actually drove up to Alaska and did a whole bunch of documentaries while I was up there for Bigfoot Beyond the Trail. And then we did an entire series dedicated to Area A called Dark Coast, Hunt for the Alaskan Bigfoot. And that was kind of a cool series to do, because it's a 5-part documentary series that basically is it's like a raw kind of boots on the ground sort of style. There's not a lot of interviews, not a lot of narration. It's very much, hey, you're going to see footage of us trudging around an Alaskan hillside in the rain for like an hour, and that kind of stuff. So some people maybe like that style, some people don't, but it was just us trying to show what we could find out there and document everything as best we could. We were trying to use different types of tech. We had a guy with a thermal drone out there, Damon Irons, who's a Bigfoot researcher from the West Coast. We had Rebecca Slick of the Olympic Project join us for part of it. Larry Beans Baxter, and even my brother was out there, and some of the other guys at the cabin. So we were there for 2 weeks, as opposed to the first time we went, it was just 1 week. That second expedition was 2 weeks. And the idea was, you've got these areas like Area X and other places where it seems like they have some sort of activity over longer durations of time. Maybe that's what you need to do, is just kind of take that, I don't know, Diane Fossey, Jane Goodall approach. Just try to get out there as long as you can and see if anything starts happening. So that was the idea behind Dark Coast. So it was really awesome to be able to document that place. And it's just one of the most beautiful places on earth. Hard to argue with that. You just take one look at it, Bigfoot or not. Who would not want to go to a place like that, right?
What tactics are you usually trying to employ in different places? And does it change, depending on what the terrain is, or if there's snow on the ground? What kind of things are you trying to do out there to elicit a possible response?
It's a good question. I think it is situational and depends on the location. If you're in an environment like the Honey Island Swamp in Louisiana, I was just there a couple weeks ago, filming a follow-up to a video I did last year there. That's a totally challenging environment where you're dealing with venomous snakes and gators, and there's water everywhere. You need to take a boat just to get out to some of these locations. You just physically can't access. So your tactics are a little different, but it's a smaller environment as opposed to Alaska, where you've got there's more wilderness than there is civilization by far. It's ridiculous how much is up there, especially after driving up there. Driving through parts of northern Canada, northern BC, the north or the Yukon into Alaska. It's frightening how much space is still out there. I don't think people really realize it, especially if they live in the lower 48 of the U.S. Like there are still some wild places in the West, even up in Maine, up in my neck of the woods in New Hampshire. There's still some pretty wild places, even down south and throughout the Appalachians. There's some, very interesting areas, but it's really all nothing compared to parts of Canada and Alaska where you're talking about millions of acres where almost nobody lives. I mean, that is hard to imagine, right? But in terms of tactics, yeah, I mean, at a place like Area A, we were kind of going off of some of the stuff that guys had previously talked about. They would mostly be hanging out and stuff would start happening. There wasn't really much of an aggressive push, I guess, from the researchers' side of things. When we had stuff happen that first trip, we were like sitting around a campfire and we started hearing wood knocks and what sounds like rocks being thrown. Like, we didn't really elicit anything. We were just literally just kind of shooting the breeze around a campfire. On this 2-week expedition, we didn't have a lot happen, but also it was raining almost the entire time. I mean, it's a rainforest, temperate rainforest, so kind of makes sense, but nothing really that intriguing happened as compared to that first trip where there seems like we heard more sounds and, found like a weird handprint on the backside of the cabin, which still 50-50 on that, but it was intriguing enough that we felt it was worth having somebody like Larry, who has a police background, collect the sample. Just in terms of documenting your evidence. So, yeah, I mean, I know that there's a lot of different techniques, a lot of different things that people in Bigfoot research do. I mean, we've tried a lot of different stuff over the years, from your more stereotypical knocking on trees and whooping kind of stuff, which a lot of people seem to really despise. But, hey, it's worked sometimes. A lot of times when stuff has happened, it's when we're least expecting it, or we're hanging around at Louse Camp in Bluff Creek and weird stuff just starts popping off. But I think some of the stuff that I've kind of been trying to focus on is footage, thermal footage, so like thermal cameras, thermal units, thermal drones as well. Like I said, we used that up in Area A this past summer, which was cool. We got to film a bunch of Sitka black-tailed deer, which technically are not supposed to be on that part of the Kenai Peninsula. If you ask like Alaskan wildlife officials, right, they're not supposed to be there, but we know animals don't care about our boundaries. They just kind of go where they want. So it's cool to establish that there are creatures that aren't supposed to be there with stuff like a thermal drone. I mean, you're just flying around in these mountains in areas that would take you hours to get up to. You can just be up there in 30 seconds with a drone, right? I mean, it's incredible technology. And I've focused a lot on thermal filming, so when I'm out at night especially, because you never know. I mean, I think largely, and this, I don't know, this kind of goes against what I'm saying, I suppose, but I think footage and photos are largely useless in 2024. They've probably been useless for the past decade, honestly, because there's alleged video thermal footage out there that, it's never been established as real, but there's some pretty good stuff out there and it hasn't really moved the needle, so to speak. We've had Photoshop for a while, but now, of course, we have this onslaught of AI. I don't think photo video is ever really going to be good enough anymore. It hasn't been. I mean, you've got stuff like Patterson-Gimlin film, if that is legitimate, that's been around for over almost 60 years at this point. So it hasn't made that much of a difference. But I think as a personal achievement, it'd be really cool to get something interesting on a thermal camera, because that's something that you can at least then do a follow-up investigation. Thermal, I don't want to say are hard to fake. You can definitely do it. It's been done. You've seen some of these TV programs. They've kind of, they have these cheesy fake thermal videos, but I think it's a little harder to fake that kind of thing as compared to just throwing on a monkey suit and running in the woods and having a guy shake camera, blurry type of footage. Like, you could do a follow-up investigation with a piece of thermal footage, and if you could couple that with another type of evidence, maybe some physical evidence, some footprints, hair, whatever, audio, you then have different tiers of evidence that you can kind of weave into a more coherent picture. Like, well, here we have video, we have audio, we have some physical evidence, so you have kind of like a trifecta of possible evidence. And I mean, I don't think that's going to sway the skeptics or the scientists necessarily, but you can at least be able to do your due diligence and sort of say, hey, all right, well, we did our best, and this is our follow-up, and we try to take it as seriously as we could, and this is what we were able to find. Now, you can believe it's real or not. That's up to the person, I suppose, but we have a sort of chain of custody with all of the pieces of evidence that we are presenting, and we can kind of defend that and have people tear it apart. And I think that's part of, if you do get some footage or evidence, you should be willing to answer the tough questions and have people be able to tear it apart and poke and prod it. I think people get emotionally attached to their alleged evidence, and if it doesn't stand up to the scrutiny, then, they might get a little defensive. And I think that happens a lot in this topic. I think that's the wrong approach, to be honest, because, you can think you have some incredible footage, but what if somebody's able to disprove it? I mean, you should be able to accept that result. It's not, unless it's 100% certain, can you really be certain, right? So that's kind of the approach I try to take, and be very critical. And I guess I'm kind of hard to please when it comes to evidence and that sort of stuff. So I don't know if I answered your question or not. I kind of went on a deep dive tangent there, but
I love tangents. That's what the show is
Yeah.
built on. So don't even worry about that, because I'm the worst about it, or the best if people like the tangents. So no, it was great. So are there any videos or photos that you personally think are pretty damn legit?
Oh man, that's a tough question. Yeah. Yes, I mean, Patterson Gimlin film, obviously, it's kind of the cliche answer, I think is really interesting. I don't know if it's real or not 100%. But having been there, we went out to there. It was one of the first Beyond the Trails we ever did, was in 2021. And that was really interesting, going to the film site and seeing how remote that area still is to this day. Kind of made me think, why didn't these guys they could have filmed this outside of the town of Willow Creek and saved themselves 2.5, 3 hour trip up into the mountains, especially back then. Why didn't they do it there? Like the background wouldn't have been much different. Like, it's all wild up there, but why they choose to go so far and so deep into the wilderness doesn't really make a lot of sense to me. So that's obviously a good one. And then the Freeman footage, I don't know. I'm still torn on it. There's a lot of interesting stuff. I've kind of talked to Michael Freeman a little bit about some of I have a casting of alleged handprint casting from Paul Freeman, and Michael Freeman, his son, has been doing a lot of stuff in the last couple of years on that stuff. And a buddy of mine named Jonathan Easley, he's got a channel called Western Bigfoot Exploration. He went out to the film site last year, so the Freeman footage site, which is in the Blue Mountains of Oregon. He went out there in the summer, and he did kind of like an investigation there, and they sort of were like, wow, yeah, this thing looked pretty big. And he came out of it convinced that maybe the footage is real. I'm hoping to get to that film site, and because that film is considered to be the second best along those lines, from 1994. It's that famous footage where guy's in the woods and it walks out of the tree line. He goes, "Oh, there it goes," kind of thing. It's pretty iconic if you're really into the Bigfoot stuff, right? So I'm still on the fence on that. If it is, I mean, if it's fake, it's a good one. If it's real, I think it's also pretty compelling and interesting. And there's other, I've got a list somewhere of footage where I've got just a few pieces of, there's the Memorial Day footage. Some of these could have been disproven for all I know, by the way. So that's just a disclaimer. I don't know. These are ones that I just find interesting. You've got the Memorial Day footage from 1996. There's also the New York baby footage from the Catskill Mountains. That was one that was featured on Finding Bigfoot back in the day, where it's like this little thing swinging in the tree. I don't know if you remember seeing that.
Yeah.
Not, that one's kind of funky. It's strange. I know Steve Cole's pretty well, and he's looked into that, and I don't want to misquote him, but I think he believes that to be legit. So, he's got pretty good judgment about these sorts of things. But that's a very weird sighting, as like somebody putting their pet monkey in the tree. You're never going to see it again, kind of thing. So that was weird. There's a couple other pieces of footage. There's one. I mean, some of these are not that great, but there's a bunch from Canada. There's one that's Saskatchewan. There's a couple from BC. There's one where it's like throwing a tree, I think in Alberta, Canada. I find that interesting. So this is just straight up footage, right? But then there's a couple of pieces of thermal footage. So one of them is the Bart Catino Sierra thermal footage. I don't know if you're familiar with that, from about 2012. That was a really interesting sequence of events. And I know some of the guys that kind of investigated that afterwards, people like Robert Leiterman and Kip Morrill of the Bluff Creek Project, Todd Hale from the Olympic Project, and just some of the people that were involved in kind of that footage. It seemed pretty compelling that they were kind of surrounded by something. They were able to get some thermal footage. Yeah, there's like the Stacy Brown thermal footage. It's pretty interesting. I still don't know where I sit on it. I mean, with all of these, I'm not 100%, right? I can't be 100%. They're just ones that I find interesting. And if they're disproven at some point, like, hey, sure. You've got the Mike Green squeaky thermal footage. I don't know why it's called squeaky. There's got to be a reason, but that one's from North Carolina, where he kind of had this thing sort of in his camp, I guess, trying to steal some kind of candy bar. So that's, I'm not going to list them all off the top of my head that I can remember, but I have a list somewhere of ones that I've thought were pretty intriguing. But again, you have all this footage. I think it goes back to the point I was making earlier, but has it really made a difference? I mean, are we any closer to the truth? if all the pieces of footage I just listed are real, I mean, is there still acceptance of Sasquatch? No, I think it's obviously going to take more than that. But that's why when I was mentioning my approach, a lot of the encounters seem to be chance, right? People are just out hiking or driving and they see something. That's some of the more interesting encounters happen that way. People are camping and something's coming into their camp, whatever. So my philosophy has always kind of been, well, we're out in these areas. If we happen to have a chance encounter, at least we can maybe be prepared. We'll have the proper camera equipment, something to record it. But as I mentioned too, having that sort of multiple pieces of evidence. So not just getting a piece of footage, but then doing an examination of the site, trying to find any kind of biological samples. Just being able to couple that, because if you look at stuff like, let's say, what the Olympic Project has done, what a North American Wood Ape Conservancy has done, where they can actually put it into a report that then could be, you could give that report to somebody with either a science background or just a kind of biological background, let's say, as a biologist, and they could be able to read it and say, okay, this is intriguing. This is proper way of formatting all this kind of stuff. And yeah, that's sort of the approach I guess I take when I'm looking at this sort of stuff.
So this is an extremely random question. I don't think I've ever asked anybody this, but considering the fact that you're always out in the bush and you have these badass cameras, right? You've got these beautiful cameras that take this beautiful footage, very high def, right? But as you mentioned, the advancement just even recently of AI is pretty spectacular. So when you take that and you've got these big, beautiful cameras shooting 4K, this and that, and you can just upload it directly to YouTube. Would you rather have footage? And again, this may not be directly for proving it per se, because as you say, and you're right, it's not working. If even one of those is real, it didn't work. So say that you could get footage with one of your badass regular cameras or footage with a thermal. Which one do you think, as far as maybe it would just be in your own mind because maybe there was a deer walking in front of it and you could have that size comparison on a thermal versus a regular camera? Which one do you think would be more advantageous?
I mean, I don't know. That's a good question. I'd like to say both, right? Just multiple people filming.
Yeah.
One guy's on a thermal, other guy's on a Sony with filming in 4K. I feel like, honestly, thermal might be more advantageous again because it might be a little bit easier to do the comparison. Just because, again, thermal footage, like trying to get something with a full body that's giving off heat, it can be done, and it's been done from what I understand, but it's not as easy as putting out a face in the woods, a Todd Standing-esque kind of Muppet face out in the woods, right? Like that, you could do that with, I guess, regular footage as compared to a thermal. Yeah, so I don't know. It's a good question. I think just personally, I would be happy to capture something either way, and again, you could do a whole transparent kind of follow-up and really try to be as open with it as possible and hey, ask me the tough questions, tear it apart. Like that's what you should be doing. You shouldn't be hostile to people wanting to get to the bottom of it because that person wasn't there. They don't know. They're taking your word for it. Maybe they trust you, maybe they don't. Doesn't matter. That should be, even if it's somebody that you're friends with, they should be able to say, well, I'm not just going to say I like it just because you're my friend. Like I want to be able to dig it apart for myself. I think that just comes back to that. But as like a personal goal, it'd be just really cool to get, thermal footage or even just footage with a drone. Like imagine you're flying the drone, you got something running by. That would just be really cool. Of course, that would be then something you could also do a recreation or whatever with, try to get to the bottom of it. But again, it's not going to make much of a difference, I feel. And that may be cynical, I suppose. But we've seen this kind of story time and time again in this topic. But it's just like a personal goal. Like people say, finding a footprint cast, that's not really worth much evidence-wise these days. You talk to somebody like Meldrum, Dr. Meldrum or Cliff, who kind of have more of an understanding of how these feet might work. Yeah, for them, that's probably interesting. For most people, it's like, oh, we've had casts for 60, 70 plus years at this point. It hasn't made a difference. But it's like a cool personal achievement, right? I've got a cast here that we captured up here in New Hampshire that's, possibly interesting, sort of ambiguous. But it's cool. It's like a cool personal effect. Yes, it can be a form of evidence. I think nowadays, something I'm a big proponent of is like 3D scanning. So a lot of the iPhones will have LiDAR stuff. So I use apps like Scaniverse, which you can then 3D scan a footprint. A lot of times you might be hiking out in the bush and you don't have plaster with you, so you can at least get a 3D scan of this thing, because that scan then has LiDAR, and it has a lot of, you can be able to look at it, you can share it with people, you can upload it to the site, have other people kind of scrutinize it. I always say, in the perfect scenario, you find a great footprint, get your normal pictures, get your video measurements, all that stuff, but then get a 3D scan and then cast it. So that, like, you kind of have, I was talking about having multiple layers of evidence, if we can call it that, multiple layers of the same thing we're looking at. So if it's a footprint or a cast set of tracks in that case, you at least then have multiple pieces of evidence you can provide to somebody and say, hey, here, take a look at it. You can physically touch it, or you can look at the 3D scan of it.
With drone footage you brought up, I'm waiting for the day when someone is watching, one of our YouTube videos and there's a drone shot, and as you mentioned, they're going, there is a Bigfoot right there. You guys need to check this out. You missed this, because it is true.
That'd be so cool.
There's just a lot of this, quote unquote B-roll that we have to get.
Yeah.
And I'm just going, come on, Bigfoot, one of these days you're going to make a cameo and
Just
we won't
walk
even know
through,
it.
yeah. Well, it's funny because, like, a lot of times I've gotten stuff before where people are like, oh, did you guys see that there was a submerged UFO in that pond you filmed on the drone? And I'm like, I go back to look at it because obviously I'm going to check it out. But I know in my mind it's kind of like, I'm going to be disappointed. It's nothing. I think people have like quite an active imagination. But yeah, it would be really cool if there were just somebody's like, yeah, you guys, how did you guys not see this? And we look back and like, wow. Well, that's crazy, right? That'd be so cool. But I guess until that happens, we'll just kind of be waiting. But I imagine, like, I usually, with my drone footage at least, I definitely scan through it. But, you're only one person, right? You have a fresh set of eyes, might be able to see something that you missed. So I feel like if I hopefully did capture something like that, it would be cool. Because in the moment, it's tough to sometimes see exactly what you're dealing with. Because when you're flying a drone out there in the woods or whatever, and let's say it's a really sunny day, I've got my phone, that's the screen, and that's a small, tiny rectangle, right? So sometimes it can be hard to miss little details if you're just flying around. You're worried about making sure the drone doesn't get too far away, and it's hard to see on that little screen that you're kind of looking at. Whereas then you put it on a bigger screen, you might be able to notice more details. There have been a few times where I've been out and filmed black bears as well as alligators, filmed a couple moose on my drone, and I was able to kind of follow them for a little bit. That was really cool. Yeah, that'd be really awesome, and I hope that happens at some point. But it'd be really even cooler if it happened with also a thermal drone, because then that gives you something that is pretty intriguing. If you have, because a lot of these thermal drones now, they'll film, like the one we had up in Alaska, it'll film thermal and kind of regular footage at the same time. So that's really neat, especially if you're filming in the daytime. I mean, if you're filming at night, one screen and one side of it is just completely black, so that's pretty much useless. But if it's a daytime shot, you'll get thermal footage on one side and the kind of regular daylight footage on the other side, so that's kind of cool.
I do wonder if we could create a drone that was completely silent and have it up for, hours and hours and hours upon end, and just film over a location like Area A or anywhere else where they're supposedly around a lot, if that would make a difference. Drones are, you can notice that they're in the area very quickly. So I know that we know that the Bigfoot would know that too.
I think it'll happen eventually. It's just a matter of time till we take what we learn from nature and be able to change it. So something interesting I learned back in the day was that if you take, I was doing survival training back in the day, and we were taught about kind of birds of prey and that sort of thing. And my professor gave me a reconstructed turkey feather, or reconstructed turkey wing, and a reconstructed owl wing. And what's really interesting is you take the turkey wing and you start flapping it through the air as if you simulate kind of flying, and you hear like you hear the swooshing sound, right? And that's what you'd hear a turkey flapping in the wind, or as it's going through the air. And then you take the owl wing and you flap that through the air, and guess what? There's no sound at all. It's completely silent. Bird of prey, right? So that's an adaptation that these birds of prey, hawks, eagles, owls, these really incredible raptors, as they're called, of the skies, compared to something like a turkey, which is more of a prey species, not exactly top of the food chain. But imagine being able then to emulate that with something like a drone or some of these kind of UAS, or unmanned aerial kind of craft, UAS, UAPs. That's been on my mind lately too. So I'm kind of mixing up my acronyms here, but Yeah, it's really interesting, and I think it'll happen because the way technology is going, drones now are actually becoming frighteningly common. I mean, I've looked at some of the stuff going on over, like in some of these conflicts, not to get into politics or anything, but you have some of these wars going on now, Russia, Ukraine, other wars before that last like 3 to 4 years, how drones have become such a critical part of those battlefields. And you have really frightening footage of people being hunted by drones, basically, right? I mean, this is like Terminator level stuff. There's no Skynet yet controlling the drones. The key word is yet, right? But there's opposing armies, and they're all using these drones, and they're using these FPV drones, which are these first-person view drones, where the guy's wearing goggles and he's kind of got a whole setup, and it's a first-person high-speed drone. And then what they do is they have those, and then they're surveilling the area with stuff like DJI Mavic, kind of the stuff that we use, or more consumer-grade drones that just give you a wide-angle view, so you're able to get confirmed on your target hit. So you see that with warfare. So you can only imagine how this is going to be applied to so many other types of situations, because wars are usually where a lot of this technology advances and is tested out in a very, unfortunately deadly and sinister kind of way. But you bet there's countries around the world trying to develop more and more silent drones. So as with stuff like the internet and pretty much a lot of the modern world, this was all before it was publicly available, was military testing, was military used equipment, right? It was military projects that eventually they trickle down into the civilian use. So yeah, silent drones will absolutely be a thing sooner than later, and you're going to get extended battery hours. I mean, even using AI probably to kind of help with that. It's going to, again, it's like a frightening Skynet kind of situation we're maybe heading towards. But as is with technology, there's good and bad. There's a lot of good applications and there's a lot of bad ones. The good ones, situations like this, where you could just have a drone, like you said, out there maybe at a place like Area A and just survey that area in a way that you couldn't do with a stationary camera, or something that just is detectable, something that's up in the sky that's completely undetectable. You'd be able to, maybe even biologists would be able to use this to monitor different species of wildlife they're looking for in a non-Bigfoot sense. Like you could just have drones in an area and be, okay, let's see what time of the year are the moose coming through here, or the elk. There's so many applications for this kind of stuff, and obviously it would be great to be able to use it in Bigfoot and cryptid kind of research too. It might make our job simpler in some ways than having to hike up and install camera traps or try to get into certain areas when, I guess it's going to make us a little lazy. Just send the drone up and do our job, right?
That would be amazing, though, to have one of those types of drones, like the FPV that you mentioned. I could see you and Seth on the same shoot, and you're like, it's a custody battle. Like, who's drawing straws for the drone today,
Right. Yeah. No, I mean, they're a lot of fun, and I've been flying drones some capacity or another since about 2017, and just kind of see the progression since then. The big clunky Phantom drones that were huge, right? The big white ones, and now you've got ones that are just getting smaller and smaller every year. It's crazy how that's going to advance. So yeah, I mean, all this stuff it can be hopefully applied within a kind of research context as well.
Yeah, let's hope so, because we get a lot of interesting things. So, all right, so zipping back to Alaska, kind of to close out that little chapter for our talk. You brought up Port Chatham, and
Yes.
the alleged happenings there was, super angry, pissed off Bigfoot essentially drove people out of that little town, right? So, and two-parter is, what are your personal thoughts about what was supposedly going on there? And secondly, what about just Alaska in general as far as aggressive encounters? Do you find that Alaska has more of those than other locations you've been to?
Yeah, that's a good question. They're both good questions. So we'll start with the Port Chatham stuff. So as I mentioned, a recent video I put out, it's called Kenai Peninsula Encounters. It's basically just a documentary about the Kenai Peninsula, because as this area is about the size of the state of Maine and it's considered to be Alaska's playground, there's some of the most famous cases in Alaskan history come from there. I mean, Port Chatham, all that other kind of stuff, the Les Stroud encounter. So I tried to highlight some of this and also paint the picture of that southern coastal region, as I mentioned, where you have Port Chatham, you have Area A, you have the encounter location of Les Stroud. It's all the same habitat. It's extremely inaccessible, and nobody basically lives there except for the species that reside there. And we now spent almost a month out there, if you combine all the time with Area A. And then my other visits to like Homer, Alaska, which is down closer to Port Chatham, although it's a pretty far boat ride. So when it comes to Port Chatham, the story is really interesting. It's one of those classic tales, right? It's in league with the Albert Osman story, or maybe Ape Canyon, or the Bauman story with Teddy Roosevelt. Like there's this tier of classic Bigfoot stories that you kind of hear about. The Ruby Creek incident, right? That are sort of established in the Bigfoot lore. And the Port Chatham thing is interesting because it's like a ghost town story, and there's plenty of those in the American West. I mean, you're somebody who lives out in that sort of desert area. You're no stranger to those kinds of stories. They're pervasive in our culture. They're very fascinating. People move to an area for a certain resource that dries up, and the town becomes abandoned. Ghost stories. It's a very fun kind of motif. It's a fun concept. Whereas this ghost town on the remote coast of Alaska has this weird added murderous Bigfoot element. Now, my personal feelings are, I think truth is somewhere in the middle. And what I mean by that is, on one side of the extreme, you have, okay, this town was abandoned in the late 1950s and kind of gradually died off, but it was all spurred on because of Bigfoot's killing people, or the hairy man, the Nantinak, whatever they called it in that area. And the town, people are like, yeah, we're getting out of here because of that. That's one extreme. I don't think that's true. The other extreme is, well, it's, I guess, more of in a skeptical or a non-believers kind of camp. Oh, there was never any Bigfoot stuff at all. The town was abandoned for other purely economic reasons. Now, I think that's partially true, but I don't think that's necessarily the case. I'm more in the middle. I think primarily the town was abandoned because of economic reasons. It was a very tough existence. I mean, there was a cannery out there, fish cannery, that burned down, and that was a big primary kind of economic driver in the area. You're logging and hunting, and imagine you're logging some trees and a giant Douglas fir tree crushes your friend to death in the middle of the Alaskan wilderness. I mean, that's a miserable way to live your life. It's very tough, resource extraction, primarily fishing, logging, hunting. That was really all that was there. And then especially as Alaska started booming in the 1950s and 60s, when it became a state, you had the oil boom. People started going up there to work in the oil industry, and places like Anchorage were getting built up. It's probably a lot easier to go work for ExxonMobil or something and get an office job in Anchorage than it was to be in some remote coastal town that takes you hours just to get there from the nearest other town that then takes you forever to get there from anywhere else. So I think economic reasons played the biggest downfall in Port Chatham. And it's not like the town was abandoned overnight. It was a gradual sort of thing that happened. And, a lot of the research and a lot of stuff I'm kind of regurgitating now about Port Chatham comes from Larry Beans Baxter, who basically wrote the book on the Port Chatham incident, which I believe it's Port Chatham, A History of Horror, The Abandonment of Port Chatham. I'm probably butchering that title, but if you look up Larry Beans Baxter, he's got that book. And, he was on one of the first organized expeditions to Port Chatham. He's done a lot of research, and he lives in Homer, so he's not that far from that area. So in my film, too, he talked a lot about his experiences. So yeah, I mean, I think there were probably some Bigfoot encounters because that, at least in my view, having spent some time on the Kenai Peninsula now, the habitat in a potential scenario of something like a Sasquatch, the habitat's there, right? You have millions of acres of untouched wilderness where you have Sitka black-tailed deer, moose, mountain goats, all kinds of seafood, salmon, just anything you can imagine. When we were at Area A, we were just amazed at the biodiversity. We've got humpback whales and orcas and seals and sea lions and sea otters swimming in the bay right next to us. And the mountains above us, we're finding deer evidence and mountain goat and black bear and brown bear, moose. So you have such an incredible biodiversity that if something was living out there, finding food, I don't think would be a very difficult task. If you were, especially if you're omnivorous, able to, it stays warmer in that part of Alaska than say up in Anchorage, up into the interior, because it's a little more mild with that temperate rainforest. They still do get snow, but it's definitely a lot cooler or a lot warmer, so to speak, than those interior, really kind of dark places that get just pummeled with the winters out there. So yeah, I mean, the Kenai Peninsula would be a great place for something like that to live. And I don't see why they wouldn't be at a place like Port Chatham. So to kind of wrap up with that first question about Port Chatham, yeah, I think the truth is more in the middle. There probably were Bigfoot stories and encounters, and the natives that live in that region, they talk about this Nantinak kind of hairy man spirit. And it's like many of the other First Nations and Native American stories across, especially the West Coast and up into Alaska, they have stories of hairy man-like creatures. throughout that area. So it's akin to a lot of those stories. Yeah, I don't see why in a place like Port Chatham, they wouldn't be there. So I'm sure there were probably some encounters, but the town was not abandoned because of murdering Sasquatch. So I think that's the unfortunate sensationalism that's taken place with the topic. But the truth is always kind of more nuanced, I guess, than the fantastical side, which is as cool as that sounds. I don't think that to be the case. And then, man, I forget your second part of the question, honestly.
No, that's okay. I was just to piggyback off that, because you've been to so many different places. Do you think Alaska does in fact have
the aggressive encounters? Yeah. So I don't know. This is a good question, because I was of the opinion for a while that you hear some of these encounters. Like, I'm in the Northeast. I'm in New Hampshire. Like, we have a history of encounters up here, but not very many violent or kind of terrible encounters, typical kind of shy, elusive Sasquatch type thing. I was of the opinion that down south there was more of a history of aggressive encounters. I think that was primarily because of certain cases like the Fouke monster. There's some aggression reported there. So I don't know if that had to do with maybe habitat shrinking and being kind of dealing with different, you live in a swamp, you've got all these poisonous and venomous animals around you. Maybe you're just more of a jerk than you might be in some beautiful northwestern forest, right? But when we went up to Alaska, obviously we heard a lot of kind of more aggressive encounters. And I don't know if that necessarily is because, I don't know if there's more aggressive encounters up there, or if it's just they're more prevalent. It's a really good question, but the animals up there are huge, right? And you have that whole Bergman's rule thing where closer you get to the equator, the smaller creatures get. Like the deer down in Florida are tiny compared to the ones I have up here. I've got moose that live near my property, and they're pretty big and scary, but compared to the moose in Alaska, I mean, those things are ice age monsters. You see like a moose driving, we saw one driving through Canada up there near the Yukon. And I mean, this thing, I feel like this thing could have flipped the car over if it wanted to, right? Just colossal beast. So animals are typically bigger. You've got the aggressive brown bear up in Alaska, the black bear too, they get pretty big. Maybe these creatures up there, if there are Sasquatch there, they're just bigger, and they deal with other more aggressive animals. So they just kind of, I don't know. I really don't know. It's a good question. One line of thought I sort of had for a while, and this, I don't know if this is the case or not, is that a place like Alaska, there's so much wilderness. You don't really have to have as much interaction with humans if you don't want to. Like if you're way out in the middle of the wilderness, you might run into some people here and there because people get everywhere, but there's millions of acres where people to this day just don't ever go in Alaska. So maybe you've got somebody out there in remote wilderness that they might seem vulnerable, let me attack this person and get an easy meal. Who's going to find out, right? People go missing in Alaska all the time. It just happens. Most of the time it's because of weather or they're ill prepared, whatever, grizzly attacks, stuff like that. It does happen. So you see with moose, even moose are some of the most deadly animals in Alaska, just how many people they attack compared to bear attacks, which is not to say bears obviously aren't aggressive, but I don't know, maybe there's more of a boldness there. Whereas if you're hypothetically a Sasquatch that lives in an area where you've got more human pressures on either side of your habitat, you probably, if they're smart enough to be elusive for this long, if they are some kind of biological creature, which we really don't know at this point, if they're smart enough to stay the way they are, they'd probably realize, well, if I attack or kill humans, that usually leads to what? Search parties, helicopters, more humans, search and rescue. So maybe in a place like Alaska, that might not be as big of a concern. I don't know. These are all just hypotheticals that I think are interesting, because when you kind of, it's like, I don't know if you want to call it, you're philosophizing about Bigfoot, or you're just kind of running through different scenarios that, okay, well, this makes sense. Well, yeah, that makes a lot of sense, actually. Those kinds of things. So I don't know. I think the stories in Alaska are just maybe more prevalent when you're up there because people have heard them, whereas still in Alaska, the majority of sightings that I was told about and heard about were those kind of typical ones where, we saw it was running through the field, or we saw it on the side of the road. That's like the majority, but maybe those more sensational encounters typically get more traction, so that might be why they're so prevalent. But like in Land of the Missing, we covered a lot of the kind of more interesting and weird encounters. That was sort of the perspective we were trying to show, was that there are some pretty strange encounters, and to hear some of the ones that people claim to have had.
Something that you said kind of knocked something loose about a conversation I recently had with Fred Roll, who is out of Alaska, and he's had a couple of run-ins with Sasquatch, and both of them didn't they weren't like high-fiving. You know what I mean? Like he came away from it going, well, I'm glad that I go out armed, but who knows if it would help. And, that story that we've heard from a lot of people. But you mentioning just how large, just physically huge they are up there ties in possibly with something that Fred said. And it was basically that, now granted if I went through it, they were seeming quite aggressive with what they were doing, but he even was sticking up for them in a way, because he basically said these things are so big that really probably anything that they would do may be perceived as aggressive by us, because they're just so damn huge. Like they could just be staring at you from behind a tree, and they're so, I mean, you're just in your mind, you might be going, that's a monster.
Menacing.
Yeah. And they might not be, they may not even, they might just be watching you. So when you said that, I'm like, gosh, that kind of reminds me of what Fred was getting at, that, whatever they do, the poor guys can't win, even if they're not trying to bash your head in.
Yeah, maybe we're just scaredy cat humans. And because you run into a moose in the woods, and this has happened to me, right? I've had a moose run past my tent at 6 a.m, which, to the moose is probably, hey, I'm just trying to get from point A to point B. The riverbank's right there, and this guy's tent is right there. And the moose is like, I'm just going to run past. But on my end, it was terrifying. I'm woken up by my brother shaking me, saying, do you hear that? And the entire ground starts shaking, and you see this hulking silhouette fly past your tent and splashing down in the water. And then you stuck my head out the tent, and I see these moose. And I'm like, well, I'm really glad they didn't run over the tent, because you're thinking about your own instinct. But again, that encounter from the moose's perspective probably was just, it wasn't trying to scare the bejesus out of us, but that's how we interpreted it. And I think that happens a lot with some of the alleged Sasquatch encounters I've heard. There's not anything maybe necessarily inherently scary about it, but like to what you're saying, that's a good point. People, you start getting rocks thrown at you, and then you see like a massive creature in the woods, you're probably going to be like, yeah, this is something sinister. But this thing was maybe just like, oh, let me mess with this person, throw a rock, and then I'm just going to watch them for a bit. Maybe there's a curiosity there. Maybe they get a kick out of it. Hey, I'm gonna freak this person out by running in front of their car in the middle of the mountains at night, and this is gonna send them off into a spiral, as happens with many witnesses and that sort of thing. So, yeah, that could be an interesting way of looking at it. I think we're so focused on our experience and perspective, we don't necessarily think about what the creatures might be.
I mean, beyond their hunting and breeding and all these things that they do in their own life, why not tap on the glass sometimes and see the hairless things run around, crazy in a campsite? Why not?
I mean, yeah, if you're observing, let's say you're observing a certain campsite for a while and you see what sets people off. I mean, other apes do this kind of stuff. And I'm not saying I think Sasquatch is the same as a gorilla or a chimp, but we have some commonality with gorillas and chimps, and look how different we are, right? But the inherent thing that we share is we're very, very curious. Chimps and gorillas in captivity, I mean, unfortunately, you see a lot of them look like they're bored half the time, but they can do magic tricks. They can, they like to experience this kind of curiosity that we all have as humans too. So if these things are maybe related to us, why wouldn't they have similar kind of curiosities? I think to me, that's one of those things, as I mentioned, like philosophizing, that makes sense to me. Because if this is some sort of primate-like creature, whatever it is, even if it's not, which, using a precedent, saying it looks like a primate, acts like one, maybe it is one, why wouldn't it be curious, right? Like if you're out in the woods all day and your life is, you're just kind of based off of trying to find things to eat and do that sort of thing. And like, hey, this will be fun. This is like our version of entertainment, messing with the people. Maybe that's what's going on. I don't know.
Yeah, they don't get to go to the movies.
Exactly.
Theme parks. We are their theme park.
Yes, exactly. We are their talk shows and their theme parks and everything wrapped into one, right?
They're like, well, at least they brought the brown pants because they're going to need them. So what about encounters? And you kind of already mentioned this, so let's go there for a minute here. What about those encounters with elements of high strangeness? Do you think that's two separate things just that happen to be inhabiting the same space, or are they connected at all?
It's a good question. I don't really have the answer. I mean, we're talking about Bigfoot. I know a lot of people nowadays, they get really riled up about this one way or another. We don't really know what's going on, but that doesn't mean we can't maybe surmise what might be going on, right? Looking at what little data we have, which is primarily eyewitness kind of testimony. of all the people I've talked to, which is probably a few hundred at this point, I don't even know. I know we've interviewed upwards of 100 plus people, whether they be researchers or witnesses or anybody kind of involved in the topic for just Beyond the Trail. We've interviewed so many people, and I've personally interviewed so many people with, doing live streams and stuff on my own. A majority of the encounters, like a vast majority, there's nothing inherently unusual about it other than, seeing a large ape man creature in the woods. That's obviously inherently unusual, right? It's not supposed to exist, but there's no other weird elements. There are some, but a minority of reports I've taken, people talk about they see orbs and there's other high strangeness kind of stuff going on. So I'm not discounting it, but it doesn't seem to be the norm, right? Most people's encounters, it crossed the road in front of me. I saw it while hiking and it was on the side of the mountain, that kind of stuff. It came into our camp and was throwing rocks and we saw it move between the trees. Like, that's pretty much the extent of most of the encounters that I've heard, most of the people I've talked to. They usually weren't expecting it. And they're obviously, like I said, that minority. Doesn't mean either of them is like the definite what is going on. I mean, there could be more than one thing going on. But I typically tend to think, if let's say you saw an orb in the woods and then a deer ran out afterwards, are you going to assume that deer was paranormal because there's an orb in the woods and you see an orb and then you see a Sasquatch afterwards? Do you assume that's connected? Maybe because those are two strange things, you might connect them. But, I'm pretty open-minded to a lot of the different possibilities, but I typically try to keep it very grounded. And like I said earlier, I'm kind of hard to please in terms of evidence. I'm pretty skeptical of a lot of things and a lot of claims. But once you start looking at some of those patterns, especially if we're talking about like a biological reality, you look at different sightings that have happened in different regions and you start plotting it out, behavioral consistencies, that sort of stuff. It speaks to there possibly being a species involved. That doesn't mean there can't be other weirdness involved. I'm not saying that, but if we're looking at it from a perspective that we kind of understand, that's how I tend to look at it. But I don't know. I know there are weirder things out there. Like the world is a very strange place, so to speak. But I've seen the weirdest thing I've ever encountered was a UFO in Pennsylvania in 2019, and that just came out on YouTube because we talked about it for On the Trail UFOs. You probably remember that back in 2019, where I get to show that footage that we got in Pennsylvania. And that video just came out on the STM YouTube channel. I know the film's been out for a while, but in the series format. But that's the weirdest thing I've ever seen. I have no explanation for it. Was it secret government tech? Maybe. Was it extraterrestrial nature? I don't know. I just know it didn't look like anything I've ever seen, and the way it behaved was super weird. So I know there's a possibility for other weird things to exist out there, but I kind of typically like that. You're not compounding too many different mysteries into one, right? You're not answering one mystery with another one. So just trying to look at Bigfoot from one perspective, but being open to the other possibilities, but not discounting things, right? Like I said, I'm open-minded. I don't discount anyone's encounter right away. I'd like to do some digging and kind of conclude for myself what might be going on. But the overwhelming credible data kind of hinges more on not really as a high strangeness sort of thing with the Bigfoot thing, if that makes sense. Again, I'm not saying it's not a possibility. I just think the data doesn't really reflect it at the moment.
What was it that Seth said to you when we were sitting at the table at the B&B and doing your interview? He said something like, "Well, what did the dog say?" I can't remember what that was.
Yeah. Because I was talking about all the people that were present for the UFO sighting, and I'm like, well, there was myself, there was five humans and one dog, because I was like, there's a multi-species event, right? And he's like, well, what did the dog say? And I think we all just started bursting out laughing. Yeah. He was probably as weirded out as we were. And then he's like, well, I'm going to go scratch my butt now. That's probably his next thought. So.
I mean, it's a valid question because animals do react to this stuff,
It is, yeah. It's interesting. That's what I like about, I've got a buddy, Brian, who I go out with squatching a lot, and he's got a dog. And it's always really cool when we bring Chewy out. And Chewy's always like on alert. Like, oh, he definitely hears something in there. And then it turns out to be a porcupine, or we hear something crashing through the woods. Man, that could have been a moose. Who knows? But Chewy's like onto it right before we are. We're just kind of like happy-go-lucky in the woods, like, oh, hum-de-dum, humans walking around the woods as loud as elephants, and the dog is just laser-focused on what's out there. So it's nice to have a different species around that has a lot more heightened senses than we do, because our senses are pretty pathetic if you look at it compared to other species.
Yeah, that's for sure. That's why the Bigfoot are always like, man, I heard you and smelled you and saw you about 3 miles ago.
away.
Yeah. They're like, yeah, you're trying to sneak up on us. Okay, bro.
Pathetic.
Yeah.
We are the ones who knock, so to speak.
Yeah.
We're the ones who initiate contact.
May as well get a bullhorn out and announce our presence. All right, so let's...
Hey, some people do that. Yeah, that works too.
Yeah. Play some baby cries. I've had that experience.
Yeah.
It's very interesting.
Yeah. We did that once in northern Maine, up in the North Maine woods, which is like millions of acres of privately owned logging land. Crazy up there. Moose everywhere. And we were in the middle of a lake at night, and I kayaked out there and had a speaker. I was playing baby noises, and Eli was on the shore, and they were kind of like surveying just to see if anything would come out. We didn't hear anything, but it was... I mean, the echo on the lake, there's like a mountain above us. So freaking creepy, man. And there's no one around for miles. So you're just like, something starts responding to these baby cries. It's terrifying.
Stephen King like pops out from the wood line like, oh shit, we're in Maine. I forgot.
Yeah, right.
All right, so your new documentary series is titled Strange Places, and correct me if I'm wrong, but it comes out Sunday, February 25th, right? And
that's correct.
For anybody listening right now, though, because we're recording, of course, before that date, if you're listening to this, it's out, so go watch it, and that is on YouTube, correct?
Yep, it's the Small Town Monsters YouTube channel. It's where pretty much most of my stuff is out, because I do, obviously, my series, Bigfoot Beyond the Trail. I've been doing that since 2021 at this point on the channel. And, we've done we've got tons of series, and we've got Eli's stuff, Seth's stuff, Sasquatch Unearthed, Mysteries and Monsters. Gosh, so much. I did that Alaska Dark Coast 5-part. It was kind of like a mini series. And then this is called Strange Places, which I'm super excited for because, I didn't start out with Bigfoot when I started my cryptozoology kind of filmmaking stuff, or even just filmmaking. I started with... I'd visited North Korea in 2015. I did a little documentary on that. And then I did a thing on the Loch Ness Monster because I visited Loch Ness. And then I started doing Bigfoot stuff. I started with a Lake Monster series in 2018 with my first project with Small Town Monsters, which was On the Trail of Champ. And that kind of gave birth to the whole On the Trail of format that's been so much fun to work on and see where Seth has taken it. But then Strange Places is kind of a return, I guess, to my roots in just a weird places. And there's so much under the sun that's going to be covered in Strange Places, which I'm really excited about. The first episode, which again, as of the recording of this, is not out, but you can watch it when you listen to this, is about the land between the lakes. And this is an area that, you were there, and we were there for the shoot. We were all kind of filming different projects, but we were going out to these really cool locations. And we went out to Martin Grove's sighting location, and his entire interview is in this episode of Strange Places. But I also wanted to cover some of the true crime kind of stuff, the vampire cult. I heard all these weird stories while we were there at the LBL. Vampire cults, abandoned locations, government land seizures that just have left ruins in the middle of the woods out there, cemeteries all over the place, really weird stuff. And I thought this would be a perfect kind of topic for the first episode of Strange Places. But going forward, the series is going to cover a lot of different stuff. We're going to do abandoned locations, kind of forgotten history. I was in Louisiana recently, and I visited some abandoned forts along the Mississippi River that have a really fascinating history, not only in U.S. history with the War of 1812 and the Civil War, but possible cults inhabiting some of these forts. There's going to be a lot of cool stuff like that covered, abandoned military installations, strange history. Some of it's going to involve some paranormal topics. Some of it might not. It might be about the location, but that's what I love about it. It's so broad of a topic that there's so many different things you can cover. They can be a weird region. So like the LBL, that's a region as opposed to maybe a specific location. But it's going to be a little bit of elements of urban exploration, really like documentary style that I've kind of come accustomed to, but also some of that boots on the ground. Like, hey, we're going to take you to this location and you're going to explore with us, sort of thing. So I'm just super excited to see how this series unfolds. And I've already got a ton of awesome locations and just topics in mind. So I think it's going to be awesome. I think people are going to really like this first episode as well about the LBL.
What's the release frequency on those? That's
a question. So I think it's probably going to be maybe monthly, bi-monthly. So what I'm kind of doing is, I love the Beyond the Trail stuff, but you do get a little burned out just about the Bigfoot topic at times. So I like being able to expand now into a lot more other things. So I'm kind of going to be alternating between the two, and also maybe some other stuff. I want to do a UFO documentary about that sighting that I was talking about a little bit ago. So I'm just kind of, I think the name of the game in 2024, especially with all of STM, is we're expanding into a lot more topics that I think we haven't before, which is really going to be very fascinating to see where that kind of goes. Not just cryptids or paranormal events, but other kinds of adjacent or related topics. And I think Strange Places fits pretty well into that whole kind of small town monsters mantra, because it's not just about the small towns, but it's about these areas and the communities and the physical locations. That's part of a lot of this folklore, a lot of the urban legend is based around locations, places like the LBL. So I think that's going to be a really cool way to return to kind of that spirit of STM as it was originally envisioned. I mean, but it's just so cool to see how STM has changed over the years and all the different directions we've gone into. And, I've been around now for a few years, and I remember when it was just Seth basically doing the movies by himself, and we would take vacation time to go on film shoots, right?
Yeah.
Like that was back in those days. It was just kind of like we were making up the rules as we went along. We didn't really know how it was going to go, but seeing so many different filmmakers and people we've been able to bring on now, and it's become such a great creative point for so many different people with different perspectives to share, whereas like I'm more of like a physical boots on the ground, Bigfoot type researcher. I like to visit locations. I'm like I want see, touch, smell kind of person. That's more my style. Some people love that. Whereas some people might be more into the theoretical stuff about, let's look into the origins of some of this paranormal history, So I think there's a room for everybody at STM with that sort of stuff. But to circle back, Strange Places, super excited for it. I think it's just going to be awesome to showcase so many different things. And, I'm just stoked for it. So just keep your eyes on it. It'll be coming out in a sort of semi-monthly basis, I'd say, going forward.
I love that you're touching on true crime. That is something that I consume a lot of content with true crime.
Yeah,
Always
I
love
that
stuff. And so huge high five on that. And I hope that you keep peppering that in or make that, a bigger part or a separate something someday. That would be incredible.
Oh, yeah. I mean, I'm a huge fan of like The Sopranos, one of my favorite shows, The Wire, some of these mafia kind of shows. I really like that when I'm not thinking about being in the woods, but it's like the bizarre crimes, right? I mean, we did a documentary a couple of years ago in the Bridgewater Triangle, which is one of my favorite places, and it's only a few hours from me here up in the Northeast. And you cannot talk about Bigfoot sightings in the Bridgewater Triangle or pukwudgies or other weird phenomena without touching on the weird cult murder connections, the strange crimes that have happened there. It's like you have to talk about that. So that was the same case with the LBL. When we were down there and I heard from one of the guys we were interviewing, I'm asking him, hey, what are the weird crimes that have happened out here? And he starts telling me about the vampire cult. And I'm like, whoa, slow down. We got to talk about this more. And then every other interview I did after that, I would ask people that are researchers of the LBL, hey, what do you know about the vampire cult? And it just led me down this path, and I was able to include a whole segment on that in the Strange Places episode, because it's one part of the story of the LBL. You have other crimes that have happened. Then you've got obviously the beast of LBL stuff. You can't really talk about the LBL without mentioning a lot of the other stuff. So that's I tend to take a pretty broad view about some of these topics. So yeah, if you want to learn about the vampire cult and other weird stuff, and definitely stay tuned for Strange Places.
Oh, I can't wait to watch that one. I had no idea about the whole vampire cult thing. That's amazing. I would have been, my eyes would have lit right up.
Crazy. And it's one of those things that I just didn't know before, because, you look up like the LBL, you Google it or YouTube it, and it's all you're getting is the Dogman stuff, right? That's like all people ever want to talk about. And I'm not huge into that topic. Like, I'm interested in it marginally. And I think the way I covered it in this Strange Places episode is like my own take on it, and talking about like Martin Grove's encounter and that sort of thing. But you're on location, you learn about something like Vampire Cult or the Vampire Hotel, because people like Joe and Jesse of Hellbent Holler, who were crucial to making the documentary, they had said, yeah, we want to take you to the Vampire Hotel. I'm like, what is the Vampire Hotel? Yeah, that has to do with the Vampire Cult. And so you learn about it on location, and I didn't even know that was an angle I was going to be taking. So that's something that, like in this upcoming Strange Places about these forts in Mississippi, or in Louisiana, excuse me, along where almost the mouth of the Mississippi River. And these forts are some of the most historic in American history that have been through multiple wars and all this other stuff. And I find out that there was possibly a cult that lived in one of them before it was abandoned. I mean, that's the kind of stuff that I'm like, okay, I want to learn more about that, and I want to share that with people. And it's a little bit of an element of forgotten history too that I think I like to cover in Strange Places.
Yeah, congrats on that, man. Yeah, and that's on Small Town Monsters YouTube channel. And then, of course, I should just in periphery at least mention the squad. So squad members, it's the paid side of STM over there on YouTube, and there's a boatload of extra content on there. So I wanted to make sure to mention that.
So Squad is cool because, these films essentially are made to be in 4K. Like, that's what we film in. They just look better that way. 1080 version is fine, but with Squad, you get to check out all of the films, not just my series, but anything that's on like the YouTube more episodic content. You get early access. Usually what happens is like the video will come out publicly on a Sunday, right? But the Squad version comes out on a Wednesday. So you have like a good 3-4 days where you get to watch it, not only in 4K, but ad free. So there's no ads or anything because, YouTube is crazy with that stuff. So it's like the best way to watch it, I guess, in my view. But then you got some of the behind the scenes, some of the other stuff. There's other benefits too, which is cool. But yeah, we're also, this is something I guess I'll plug. I don't know a whole lot about it. I know we're kind of still working on it, but YouTube is the primary place for some of our episodic series now. Obviously the other films go on to other platforms and Tubi and Amazon and wherever. But we are doing this kind of, which we announced, Unexplained TV, which will be kind of really cool because it's going to be able to way that we're going to be on a lot more streaming platforms and like smart TVs and stuff like that. Whereas we're going to be able to control the programming. So you might be able to find that channel on your smart TV. It's the STM Unexplained TV, and then it's an all-day Bigfoot Beyond the Trail marathon, or it's an all-day UFO marathon. And it's like all the documentaries STM has ever done on UFOs in one day. So there's a lot of really cool stuff on the horizon for STM in terms of where our content will be viewable.
And in closing, we have to mention the Kickstarter, which is still alive and kicking for now. It closes Saturday, March 2nd at a very specific time, 3:59 p.m. PST. So I really hope that everybody goes over there, checks out the various pledge levels that you can get all these incredible rewards from STM. And the films for 2024 on this Kickstarter are Cryptid the Goatman, Dogman Territory, Werewolves in the Land Between the Lakes, On the Trail of Bigfoot, The Ancients, and Lost Contact. And I should have checked, actually, before I just said that about the different pledge levels. I believe that they're all still open. Like, do you know if some of the producer levels have been filled up yet and things like that? I should have checked that.
That's a really great question. I think there's still probably a few of them left. I know there's a lot of them have filled up, but I think I'm looking at the page right here. Like on some of them some of them are left. Some are already filled up, actually, like the base camper level. Yeah, so there's a few that are kind of filled up, but definitely check out the Kickstarter. And just to kind of go over that real quick again, Shannon mentioned all the different films that are associated with those. So those are films that these are the kind of films that go up on like streaming platforms. But these are films that when you become part of the Kickstarter, you get access to them depending on the level. You're either going to get digital copies or physical, like DVDs. So the thing with the Kickstarter is a lot of people get confused about what it is. It's basically, it funds our entire year. So everything that STM does is done directly through the Kickstarter. So that also includes all the YouTube series. So like all the stuff that I do, Eli, Seth, we're bringing on other people doing other series as of late too. All those series are basically funded by the Kickstarter. So it's not just the films that are on the slate, but those are the major films that you get access to based on what level you pledge at. So it's a huge help because it allows us to really remain independent in the way that we have. I mean, STM's been doing Kickstarters since, this is going to be like the 9th or 10th year in a row. Again, back to when it was just Seth doing them. And then as the team got bigger and bigger, it kind of became more of an emphasis. But it's a really cool way for people to be involved because you're not just, sending money and then we make all these productions, but you're actually directly kind of participating in a way. You're getting your name in a lot of the credits and that sort of thing. And you're getting physical rewards. So it's not like it's just a theoretical, like, oh, it's in the ether, it's floating around, like it's there, it's a concept. No, you're going to be getting stuff, and you can back at a level where you can get like the Gene St. Jean statue. They do a statue every year based on one of the films. This one's the Goat Man. And he's a guy who just does incredible, conceptual, art for like figurines and action figures and that sort of stuff. So there's hoodies and shirts, and I mean, I don't even know the level of rewards. It's like crazy how much there actually is, but there's a ton. But basically any level you back, you're going to get some sort of rewards, whether they be the films ahead of time or tons of other goodies. So it's like it's a win-win, because it allows us to do what we're doing, but it also, you're not just empty-handed. Like you're going to be getting something no matter what level you back at.
Yep, I back every year, and I always will, no matter what, because it's just, you guys do good work, and we love what we do, and we want to keep doing it because people tend to eat it up. Oh, by the way, I saw, and this is a post from April of last year, but the collective views on Bigfoot Beyond the Trail is 10 million.
It's actually 15 million now.
Woohoo!
Yeah, so that was, about a year ago. I guess that would have made sense, about 10. I think it was 15 million when I last checked. And that's just, collective views on YouTube. So that's pretty cool, because it tells me that, there is people do want to see content and documentaries on this topic that I think reflect more of the true nature, in my opinion, of what Sasquatch is and what the research is, where, there's not that over sensationalism. There's no faking it. Like, we don't believe in any of that stuff. I think STM throughout its conception has been trying to take these mysterious topics seriously and give them a sense of respect, and the people who experience it a sense of respect. So, I've been super blessed to be able to do what I'm doing, and I don't have like somebody telling me, oh, you have to add in fake sounds and fake Bigfoots, and those are the tropes that like most TV shows fall into, and that happens a lot. And we've actually been copied a couple times in some of these major shows, especially some of our Alaska stuff. And I won't say any names, but even recently I've been getting messages, people saying like, oh, they basically lifted your Alaskan coastal Sasquatch format for this new show. And I'm like, well, I mean, it doesn't surprise me, but I guess it's kind of cool. It's like, imitation is the best form of flattery, right? These people, they can't think of anything original, so they gotta steal from us. Yeah, like I said, it's just really cool to be able to do what we're doing and see that we have a positive reception with the audiences, and people on YouTube and elsewhere seem to love it. And I've met so many great people through it, and tons of witnesses and tons of cool experiences that I've had through connecting with some of the people that have enjoyed this sort of stuff. And I get messages too from people that aren't even into Bigfoot stuff, and they're like, I didn't take the topic seriously at all, and I saw one of your documentaries and I thought it was really level-headed. And then one of the biggest positives I say is people saying, man, that inspired me to go on a road trip, or that inspired me to go visit this location and get out in the woods, especially nowadays. With the way the world is, technology everywhere, we're constantly on different screens. Being able to disconnect for a while, for me at least, and for a lot of people going out in the woods, it's like the best type of medicine you can have. It's just a connection with nature, and knowing that we're inspiring people to go out. And I've even had parents message me like, oh, my kids love it, and they want to go hiking and camping now because of the show. It's like, that's so super cool to me to hear that. You don't have to believe in Bigfoot or any of this stuff at all. We welcome anybody of any kind of persuasion to check out our stuff. And, hey, maybe you learn something about the habitats and environment. Maybe it'll inspire you to get out. But if not, hopefully you can at least have a good time and laugh maybe at some of our misfortunes out in the wilderness that happen from time to time, like getting stuck in rain for 3 days straight or something along those lines. So, yeah, we have a lot of fun with it, and we try to take it seriously and not take ourselves too seriously.
All right, final question for you personally. And this is, now separate this from what we talked about as far as getting the best evidence on film,
Sure.
or proving it or anything like that. This is just a situational thing and an experience thing for you. What is your ideal Bigfoot sighting? What does that scenario look like?
Oh, man. So ideal. So this is like my perfect conditions, like the way I want it to happen, right?
Yes. And
Okay.
barring trying to prove it or get any footage, just for
Yes.
you personally, how, your experience with it.
Oh man, I would love to be sitting in, the side of a hill, place like Area A, maybe somewhere like the Rocky Mountains, somewhere just a beautiful view, and you have this clear, unobstructed view of another hillside or kind of a little valley right next to you, right? And you're just sitting all day there. I see moose come through. I see other wildlife come through. I could be sitting in maybe like a tree stand too, so just somewhere I'm comfortable, and then just see this thing Sasquatch just walk out into the field or on the hillside and just be able to observe it for a few minutes, see what it does. Is it going around sniffing the air? Is it just observant? Does it know I'm there? Just be able to observe it for, I don't know, let's say like 2 to 5 minutes, if anything. That would be like my ideal scenario. Now, if I can add, the little caveat, having a camera on the whole time as well, but not to the point where I think a lot of times what happens is people, maybe they have an encounter like this and they're so focused on trying to get the footage that they don't actually then experience it for themselves. I already have all the camera and everything is set up, so it just kind of walks right into frame. So I don't have to worry about capturing it because I'm seeing it with both of my own eyes and being able to film it. That would be my most ideal scenario.
No, that's a good answer. And then
it's a pipe dream, but
well,
it's there.
It could happen. You never know. Not impossible. And then you do the whole, you yell the "got you this time" finally instead of the other way around with those creepers. Because they're
just get a rock thrown at you right after that.
Yeah. Yeah. You.
Hey,
throw
I'll take
the rocks
it.
at
I'll
them.
take what I can get.
They're so accurate, though. I'm like, man, I don't know. We need a MLB pitcher to be like
seriously.
them.
I wonder if is it underhand or overhand? I don't know.
Yeah, you get one of those chicks from the softball leagues. Good God, man. Maybe one of those could peg one of them things. All right, so smalltownmonsters.com is the website, Small Town Monsters on YouTube, and then just go to Kickstarter.com, type in Small Town Monsters, and then it's like 4 radioactive creatures you'll see for the preview video. It'll look like an image, but it's a preview video that you can see what's going on over there at Kickstarter so you can get your rewards. Alex, thank you so much for joining me today.
Yeah, awesome to be here. Had a good time philosophizing about Sasquatch and other things. Always fun talking with you.